That thing belongs in a dumpster, Dad, not on your wrist. That was the sentence that broke something in me. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't thrown in a fit of rage, it was said with a laugh, sharp, careless, and laced with a smirk, as my daughter walked past me on Christmas morning. The same daughter I had once held in trembling arms the day she was born. The same little girl who used to ask me to tell her bedtime stories about when Grandpa was a soldier. Now she wouldn't even look me in the eye. Sophie was dressed in something sleek and expensive, her blonde hair twisted in a perfect updo, her phone practically glued to her hand. She looked like a magazine cover, all angles and polish. I, on the other hand, sat in my favorite old armchair by the fireplace, holding a small velvet cloth and gently polishing the only thing I had left from my father, an old pocket watch with a cracked glass face and brass edges dulled by time. It wasn't much to look at now. The chain was a little tarnished, the ticking faint but steady, but it still worked. It always had. She turned to me, raising an eyebrow. Seriously, you're still fussing over that thing. You should have sold it years ago. Might get you, what, $50? I looked down at the watch in my palm, as if seeing it for the first time. The metal was warm from my touch. I had wound it that morning like I always did, listening to the familiar click and tick, the quiet rhythm that had marked so many moments of my life. My father had worn it through war. I wore it through loss, through raising a daughter alone, through long nights and empty holidays. It wasn't just a watch. I'm not selling it, I said quietly. Sophie scoffed. Of course you're not. Her tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was dismissive, like I was a child clutching a toy, too stubborn to grow up. And then came the laughter. Just a short, breathy chuckle, but it echoed in the silence between us like a slap. She turned away, already scrolling through her phone again. Anyway, dinner at Mark's tonight. His family wants me to bring you, but honestly, it's probably better if you stay. They have certain standards. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My hands were still holding the watch, still polishing as if I could rub away what I'd just heard, as if I could erase it. But I knew better. What hurt wasn't her words. It was what they revealed. Somewhere along the way, the values I had tried to pass down had been lost. She didn't see a legacy in that watch. She saw junk. She didn't see her father. She saw a man clinging to the past. The past. I glanced down at the back of the watch, where a small engraving had faded but not disappeared. I didn't need to read it. I knew it by heart. For the man who saved my life, 1945. That was my father. That was what this watch meant. And Sophie, she didn't care. As she walked out the door with a dismissive wave and a promise to text later, I sat there in the silence, holding that ticking memory in my hand. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted. She had laughed at the one thing that still tied me to my own father. But soon, very soon, she would learn the truth behind what she mocked. And when she did, that laughter would never return. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Please take a second to leave a comment below. Where are you listening from? Has something like this ever happened to you or someone you know? If this story touches you, consider subscribing and sharing it with others. It truly helps us grow this channel and bring you more heartfelt stories every single day. Now, let's continue. I didn't touch the watch the next morning. Not out of forgetfulness, no. I remembered it too well, but because her words still clung to me like a bitter cold. Throw it away or sell it for scrap. She had said it so casually, like the watch wasn't a piece of my life, like it wasn't soaked in history, in memory, in blood. I'd sat up that night in the dim light of the kitchen, the ticking of the old thing still echoing through the silence as if it were the only sound in the house. I kept thinking, how could she say that? How could she not see? But Sophie didn't see, and maybe she never had. I tried to push the hurt down, to tell myself she was just speaking out of ignorance, not cruelty. But when I walked into the living room that morning, and she glanced at my wrist with that same look of disdain, that same flicker of subtle embarrassment, as if my presence alone was tarnishing her image, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. She meant it. That wasn't a moment of carelessness. That was who she had become. We sat across from each other in the living room for breakfast. The silence between us was louder than any argument we'd ever had. She sipped her smoothie from a tall glass, scrolling endlessly through her phone, not even glancing up. Her world was filtered, flawless, fast-paced. There was no room in it for sentiment, for stories, or for men who carried broken things in their pockets. I noticed her eyes flit to the mantel where I used to keep the watch on display in a small glass box, nestled on a cushion of red velvet, a gift from her mother, back when we were still a family. Sophie stared at it for a second, then looked back at her phone. No words, just that look, as if it were a stain on the room. Something in me crumbled. That night, when the house was quiet and Sophie had gone to sleep, or gone out, I didn't even ask, I took the watch from its box and held it in my palm. The gold was dull under the lamp, its face scratched, but it was still beautiful to me. Not because of what it was, but because of what it held. My father had touched this. His hands had wound this spring. His breath had fogged the glass. He had carried it through war, through hunger, through fear. And when he'd handed it to me, on the same day he told me he was dying, he'd said, "This isn't just a watch, son. It's everything I've lived through, and everything I couldn't say." I used to believe Sophie would understand one day. I was wrong. I stood in the hallway for a long time, gripping the watch like a stone in my hand. Then I opened the hallway closet, knelt down, and placed it gently inside an old box with some winter scarves and worn photo albums. I didn't bury it, but I didn't display it either. It didn't feel right anymore, not after what she said. And as I closed the door, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel rage. I felt something much heavier, disappointment. Not just in her, but in myself, for raising a daughter who couldn't recognize value unless it sparkled, for handing over my life's quiet wisdom to someone who only listened when the world applauded, for forgetting that legacy doesn't always survive in blood. Sometimes it fades. But I didn't forget her words. I couldn't, and I wouldn't, because something told me that life, real life, has a way of circling back, of teaching us, whether we ask for the lesson or not. And her lesson was coming. Winter settled into the corners of the house like an unwelcome guest that no one had the courage to ask to leave. The mornings grew quieter. The evenings stretched long and heavy, and somewhere between the ticking of clocks and the hum of kitchen appliances, something between us, something once warm and effortless, simply vanished. Sophie still lived in the house, but it felt as though she had moved out a long time ago. She came and went in silence, her heels tapped across the hardwood floor with mechanical precision, her phone always in hand, her eyes locked on a world far from here. I no longer asked where she was going. She no longer bothered to say. We became two ghosts sharing a space that used to be a home, and the air between us, it was not filled with anger. That might have been easier to fight. No, it was filled with something worse. Indifference. She would leave for meetings in high-end blouses and immaculate makeup, pausing only to glance at herself in the hallway mirror. I would sometimes stand nearby, pretending to read the paper, hoping for a word, a smile, a "how are you?" But nothing ever came, just a blur of perfume and the quiet click of the door closing behind her. She was chasing something, status, approval, image, perhaps even love. But whatever it wasn't here. It wasn't with me. Once we used to laugh in this house. She'd sit beside me on the couch with her legs curled beneath her, asking stories about when I was her age, or when her mother was alive. She used to listen. She used to care. But now when I spoke, her eyes wandered. Her responses were curt, if they came at all. I started counting how many words we exchanged per day. Some days it was under 10. The watch, tucked away in that hallway closet, seemed to beat in my memory like a hidden wound. I missed its weight in my hand. But more than that, I missed what it used to represent. A bridge between generations. A silent vow passed from father to son. Now even the memory of it felt unwelcome in this house. One evening, as the sky bruised into dusk and the wind scratched at the windows, I set the table for dinner. Out of habit, 2 plates, 2 glasses. I made her favorite, roast chicken with rosemary, just like her mother used to make. I placed the dish down and waited, listening for the sound of her key in the lock, hoping tonight might be different. But she didn't come home. At midnight, I covered the food in foil and placed it in the fridge. I sat at the table with my glass of water and stared at the second plate. My reflection looked back at me from the empty surface. Tired, quiet, forgotten. The next morning, she breezed through the kitchen on her way to something more important. "I had dinner with clients," she said, almost as an afterthought, not even pausing. I just nodded, swallowing whatever I wanted to say. What was the point? She no longer lived in the same world as I did, and I was no longer part of hers. I started talking to the mailman more, to the clerk at the grocery store, to old friends on the phone. Not because I needed conversation, but because I needed to remember what it felt like to be seen, to be acknowledged. Because my daughter, my own flesh and blood, looked at me as though I were a piece of furniture, familiar, unmoving, silent. Sometimes I wondered what she saw when she looked at me. A man past his prime, a burden, a symbol of everything she wanted to escape. Or maybe she didn't look at all, and the house grew colder. Not in temperature, but in spirit, like something sacred had been quietly drained from the walls. I would sit on the couch alone, flipping through old albums, watching our smiles trapped in time. Birthdays, Christmases, vacations at the lake, all of it frozen behind plastic, untouched by who she had become. I wanted to ask her, when did I stop mattering? But I never found the right moment. Or maybe I stopped believing that the answer would matter. So I let the silence grow. I tended it like a garden. And in that silence, I waited. Not for her to come back. Not for things to return to what they were. But for something I couldn't yet name. Because deep inside I felt it. The past wasn't done with us yet. The morning of my 70th birthday arrived with no fanfare, no balloons, no laughter in the kitchen. Just silence. And a distant memory of what birthdays used to feel like. I woke up early, as I always did. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, letting the stillness of the room press in around me. The curtains swayed gently with the breeze. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. The city moved on, unaware that today marked 70 years of my breath and presence on this earth. I wasn't expecting a party. I wasn't expecting streamers or a cake, but I was expecting her. My daughter, just her. That's all I wanted. By noon, the house still held only the sounds I made myself. Footsteps on wooden floors. The soft clink of dishes as I set the table with a kind of quiet hope. I even used the good plates. The ones we saved for holidays. A small roast was in the oven. I made her favorite again, as if memory alone could summon her back. I kept glancing at the front door, listening for her keys, her voice, her usual sigh as she walked in. But the door never opened. At 1:07 p.m., I checked my phone for the first time. No message. At 3:14 p.m., I sat down at the table anyway. One plate, one chair, one silence. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it slightly the way we used to. To what I wasn't sure. To survival? To fatherhood? To disappointment? At 4:26 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sophie. No greeting, no happy birthday. Just a single sentence, typed like a passing thought she barely had time to send. Had better things to do today. Treat yourself with that watch money. You deserve something new. I read it once. Then again, each time it felt heavier. I stared at those words, and I realized something that hit harder than any silence ever could. She hadn't just forgotten me. She had erased me. And worse still, she believed she was doing me a favor. As if I'd been clinging to a piece of metal all these years out of poverty, or pride, or blind sentiment. As if the solution to everything, the years, the absence, the heartache, was to sell it off and treat myself. As though it was just a thing. But that watch, hidden in the back of the hallway closet, wasn't a thing. It was my father's voice. My mother's tears. It was the echo of war, of sacrifice, of a man who came home broken but still believed in passing something down. And I had kept it. Not for money, but because it reminded me of everything that mattered before the world became too loud to hear it. And now my daughter, the last thread between past and future, had laughed at it, and told me to sell it like scrap metal. I didn't reply to her message. What was there to say? The sun dipped below the skyline, casting golden light through the kitchen windows. It made the dust dance in the air like ghosts. I sat there, unmoving, as the roast grew cold and the wine in my glass lost its warmth. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even feel numb. I just felt old. Not in body, but in soul. 70 years. And in that moment, I wondered if I had spent them well. If all the effort, all the sacrifices, had been poured into a legacy that no one would carry forward. A name soon to be forgotten. a story silenced before it was ever truly heard. Later that night, I walked to the closet and opened it slowly. The box was still there, beneath scarves and fading photographs. I reached in, took out the watch, and held it in my hands like an old friend returned from war. It ticked softly, faithfully, as if it had been waiting. I didn't polish it, I didn't wind it. I just sat in the hallway, watching the moonlight glint off the curved glass, and whispered into the silence, "I remember you." And in that moment I knew. If no one else would carry this story, I would carry it to the end. Alone if I had to, but not forgotten, never forgotten. The house was quiet again, too quiet. It was just past midnight when I found myself walking barefoot through the dark hallway, the floor cold beneath my feet, the walls breathing with that strange hush that only comes in the deepest part of night. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it listens. Something pulled me back to the closet. I didn't plan it. I didn't even turn on the lights. I just moved, as if guided by something older than thought. I opened the door slowly and reached into the box, hands trembling a little. The watch sat right where I'd left it, still nestled against old scarves, surrounded by pictures yellowed at the edges, folded letters, and memories nobody wanted anymore. I cradled it in my hand and felt the same steady ticking, always ticking. Time, it seemed, was more loyal than blood. I walked to the kitchen and sat at the table. No wine this time, no food, just me, the dim glow of the stovetop light, and the weight of something I hadn't looked at properly in years. Carefully, I turned the watch over and pressed my thumbnail into the tiny groove at the back. The case popped open with a soft metallic click. There it was, the engraving. "For the man who saved my life, 1945. My throat tightened. I hadn't read those words in decades. And just like that, I was no longer in my kitchen. I was a boy again, maybe 6 years old, sitting on the edge of my father's bed, swinging my legs while he polished his boots. The room smelled like leather and old tobacco. He was humming a song I didn't know the name of, but it still lived somewhere in my bones. I asked him, "Why don't you ever wear that shiny watch, Daddy?" He looked up, quiet, then reached over to the nightstand and picked it up. He turned it in his fingers the way I did now, gently, like it might fall apart under too much pressure. And then for the first time he told me the story. It was 1945, somewhere in Europe. He never told me the name of the town, said it didn't matter anymore, just rubble and cold and gunfire in the distance. He had been ordered to fall back with the rest of the unit, but he'd heard something in the wreckage of a collapsed farmhouse, a voice, faint, pleading. Against orders, he went in. He found a young soldier trapped beneath part of the ceiling, barely breathing, his leg crushed, blood everywhere. My father could have left him, should have, maybe, but he didn't. He used his bare hands to dig through plaster and wood, hauled the man onto his back and crawled out under sniper fire. That soldier survived. His name was Lieutenant Charles Whitmore, and the day my father was discharged, Charles gave him this watch. "My father made it," he'd said, "in Switzerland. I've worn it every day since I left home. But if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be wearing anything at all." My father had taken it with quiet thanks and tucked it away in his chest pocket. He didn't wear it much, not because it wasn't valuable, but because it was sacred. "It's not just a watch," he told me that day on the bed. "It's a man's second chance, a life paid forward." That story had shaped me. It taught me about honor, about sacrifice, about the kind of courage that didn't shout. And somewhere along the line, it became more than his story. It became mine. I closed the watch carefully and held it to my chest. Sophie didn't know this. She hadn't asked, and I hadn't told her. Maybe I'd thought the story would be obvious. Maybe I'd believed legacy was something felt, not explained, but I had been wrong. She had grown up surrounded by comfort, by glossy pages and curated pictures and ambition fed through glowing screens. She saw gold in glass, not history, not pain, not sacrifice. I stayed at the table until the sun began to touch the horizon, pouring faint gold through the windows, the same shade as the old brass of the watch in my hand. 70 years. And this piece of metal had more soul than anything I owned. It had seen war. Loss, gratitude. It had passed from one broken man to another, and finally landed in the hand of a forgotten father whose daughter thought it was worth $50. But it wasn't just worth something. It meant something. And suddenly I knew what I had to do. Not for her, not for revenge, but for truth. Because stories like these, real stories, shouldn't die in closets. The next morning, I woke to a faint sliver of determination cutting through the sorrow that had settled in my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't vengeance. It was something quieter and more urgent, a need for truth. To understand what this watch, this fragile thread to my past, was truly worth in the world that had forgotten its story. I dressed slowly, pulling on a worn wool coat and my old leather shoes. The sky was steel gray, the city streets still half asleep as I walked with the watch tucked safely in my coat pocket. Each step felt deliberate, as though I were carrying something sacred through a world that no longer recognized sacredness. The auction house was an unassuming building of limestone and heavy glass doors, standing quietly on a side street I'd never noticed before. Inside, the air felt hushed, respectful, like a cathedral for objects with stories. I approached the reception desk, and a young woman looked up. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly when she saw the watch peeking from my pocket. "I'd like an appraisal," I said, my voice low with conviction. She didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and led me down a quiet corridor to a small, light-filled room. A polished oak table stood in the center. Behind it, an appraiser in a tailored suit sat, reviewing a stack of documents. He glanced up when I entered, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I placed the watch on a black velvet pad before him. His eyes moved from the watch to my face, studying me as carefully as he studied the object. There was no rush, no eager calculation of dollar signs. Instead, he leaned forward, the soft glow of the lamp catching the brass gently, and raised a single gloved finger to touch the chain, lightly, almost reverently. For a moment I wondered if I had made a mistake. Perhaps he would look at me and see only a man clinging to an old trinket. But then he traced his finger along the engraving on the back, his brow furrowing in concentration. He slid the case open and studied the movement, his fingertips steady. The silence between us was thick with questions, about history, about loss, about the weight of a promise made 70 years ago. He closed the back of the watch and placed it before him, folded his hands, and finally spoke in a voice so soft it felt like a confession. "This is extraordinary," he said. "May I ask how you came to possess it?" I told him, briefly, enough to paint the bare outlines of war and gratitude, of a soldier's gift, of my own father's silent sacrifice. His eyes glistened when I mentioned the name etched inside, "For the man who saved my life, 1945. He rose from his chair and moved to a nearby cabinet, returning with a ledger thicker than any I'd ever seen. He flipped through pages filled with listings of medals, rare timepieces, historical documents, each entry marked with precise details and careful notes. He found a similar watch sold decades ago and pointed to an entry. A prized European collection, highest bid in 7 figures. His voice caught as he read the date of that sale, nearly 30 years ago. "This piece alone could fetch over $1 million today," he said. "But its value isn't just monetary. It's a link to history, to sacrifice. It deserves a formal evaluation, archival documentation, possibly inclusion in a museum catalog." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tick echo inside me. Not a sound of loss, but of purpose. My daughter had laughed at this watch as if it were worthless. Yet here, in this hushed room, it was treated with awe. This object was more than an object. He handed me a small card with an appointment, full evaluation in 3 days. "We'll need to document every mark, every engraving," he said, "and if you're willing, we'd like to photograph it for our archives." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. The watch was leaving my hands, but not my story. It was going out into the world to be seen for what it was. On my walk home, I held the card as if it were a letter of redemption. The gray sky had softened to pale blue, and the air felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, I felt a stirring of hope. That this watch, my father's gift, would speak louder than my silence. That it would carry its truth into places I never could, and maybe, just maybe, reach Sophie's heart before it was too late. When the letter arrived, I almost didn't recognize the handwriting. Slanted, careful, the same hand that once scribbled his signature on school permission slips so many years ago. It wasn't an email or a text. It wasn't printed on stationery. It was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, the edges slightly frayed, folded into a perfect rectangle and sealed with red wax bearing a simple initial, E. Sophie found it on the kitchen counter that morning, wedged between bills and grocery ads. She held it up, eyebrows knitting in curiosity and a faint edge of impatience. She snapped the seal and unfolded the page, her manicured nails tracing the lines he had written in elegant script. My dear Sophie, come to the auction house this Friday at 2 p.m. There's something you should see. Love, Dad. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no birthday wishes, just an invitation, and in its simplicity, a challenge. Sophie twisted the paper in her hand as if testing its authenticity, then slid it into her designer clutch. She raised one perfectly arched eyebrow at me and said, Watch me. Friday came swifter than I expected, as if the world itself knew the moment was drawing near. Sophie appeared at the door in a tailored suit that shimmered with every step, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a steady rhythm of confidence or perhaps defiance. She carried an air of dismissive elegance, as though this errand was beneath her. But she went, because that was my watch on the line. Inside the lobby of the auction house, the chandeliers cast a warm glow on velvet ropes and polished floors. An assistant greeted her by name, leading her down a corridor lined with framed photographs of past auctions, diamond necklaces, rare manuscripts, paintings that hung in museums. Sophie's expression flickered between curiosity and mild contempt, as if she expected to find some trinket he'd bought for pennies. She paused before the appraisal room. Through the glass door, she saw me sitting at the polished oak table, head bowed over a portfolio of documents. On the table lay the watch, illuminated by a single spot of light, the brass case glinting like a secret. Sophie's breath caught, just for a moment, before her posture straightened, and she slipped inside. Her eyes met mine across the table, and I saw a hesitation there I hadn't seen in months. Not remorse, not pity. It was curiosity, thin but real. She cleared her throat, clutched her bag, and asked, What's going on? Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled. I gestured to the watch as the appraiser stood quietly at my side. You asked for proof, I said softly. Here it is. And then, in that charged silence, the history of that tiny instrument, engraved with words of gratitude, soaked in sacrifice, hung between us, more eloquent than any argument I could muster. The moment the auctioneer's gloved hands wrapped around the watch, the room exhaled as one. The polished floor seemed to absorb every footstep, every whisper, until time itself hushed. Light caught on the brass case, drawing every eye, and for an instant I saw Sophie's lips part, an unconscious gasp she tried to swallow back. He held it up carefully, as though it were the beating heart of a vanished world. The chatter that filled the room moments ago slipped away, replaced by a weight that pressed on everyone's chest. Sophie's high heels, which had sounded so sure and confident on the marble floor, now seemed muffled, as if even her shoes respected the gravity of the moment. The auctioneer did not speak of dollar signs or bids. Instead, his voice, measured, resonant, began to weave a tapestry of memory. This watch was crafted in 1940 by a master artisan, its gears designed not for luxury, but for endurance, he said, turning it slowly so that the crowd could see the faint scratches and bearing marks. But its true value lies beyond its mechanism. In 1945, it saved a life. A soldier trapped beneath rubble, moments from oblivion, was given a second chance because a man chose courage over orders. That man carried this watch, not merely as a timekeeper, but as a talisman of humanity amid despair. He paused, and the hush deepened. The only sound was the soft hum of the chandelier overhead, the distant echo of traffic outside, as if the world itself had stopped to listen. I watched Sophie's hands, clutching the strap of her purse so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She shifted on her feet, eyes flitting from the auctioneer to me to the watch, as though trying to reconcile the story before her with the cold dismissal she had once hurled. The auctioneer continued, This watch has borne witness to loss and hope. It has passed from one broken soul to another, carrying within it every heartbeat it ever measured. Tonight we do not sell mere metal. We honor a legacy of sacrifice, of love, of a promise kept through years that sought to dilute its meaning. I felt a tremor in my chest, pride, sorrow, vindication, all stirring together. Around me the crowd leaned in, strangers drawn into our story, their faces reflecting a reverence I had not dared to imagine. Sophie's cheeks glimmered with unshed tears as the weight of what she had dismissed settled on her shoulders like a stone. The auctioneer set the watch in its velvet cradle and raised his eyes to the audience. Let us remember that some things are worth more than wealth. They are worth memory. They are worth justice. They are worth passing on. In that moment, I saw Sophie transform. The hardened image she wore like armor began to crack, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling as if she would finally breathe freely again. And though no gavel fell and no paddle raised, the room remained suspended in that sacred pause. For once, time did not march forward. It hovered, honoring the story of a watch that was never just a watch, and a father who refused to let its truth be forgotten. The room literally held its breath when the auctioneer's gavel hovered over the podium, and he spoke the words that felt more like thunder than an announcement. We'll open at $1 million. A collective gasp swept through the assembled crowd, rippling like a wave hitting a rocky shore. Eyes darted from the shining brass case of the watch to the man who had placed it here, and finally, to me. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth as if to catch a scream trapped in her throat. The watch, once laughed at as a cheap relic, was now the most coveted piece in the room. I felt my pulse in my temples. Every tick of that tiny mechanism now echoed in the vaulted ceiling, louder than any roar of engines or clink of champagne glasses. The auctioneer raised his glove-clad hand, inviting bids, but his voice paused again, this time to remind everyone, in hushed reverence, that this was not merely a transaction. Its monetary worth, he said, is eclipsed by its history, a life saved, a promise kept, a legacy of courage that transcends time. Sophie's eyes glistened with tears she wouldn't let fall. She remembered telling me to sell it for scrap. $50, she'd scoffed. A surge of shame and awe warred in her chest as she realized her mockery had met its reckoning. Around us, wealthy collectors straightened their ties, adjusted their paddles, and prepared to stake fortunes on this single piece of history. I stood beside the auctioneer and watched Sophie's transformation. The confident woman who once measured her worth in designer brands was now unmoored, confronted by the raw power of a story she had never heard, and almost never believed. I saw her gather herself, drawing in a shaky breath, her gaze flicking from my face to the watch and back again, as though she were suddenly seeing me for the first time in years. The room stilled once more as the first bidder raised a paddle. The low murmur of escalating bids began to swirl around us, but all I could hear was the soft tick-ticking, a reminder that some moments are more valuable than the highest offer. My daughter, standing in her exquisite suit, watched with trembling resolve as the price climbed higher than our own hopes had ever dared to reach. In that charged silence, broken only by the mounting bids, I felt the weight of everything this watch had carried. A soldier's gratitude, a father's love, and now, the beginning of Sophie's true awakening. And as the paddle rose again, inching past 2 million, I knew that this moment, 1 million to start, was about so much more than money. It was about reclaiming a legacy, honoring sacrifice, and finally bridging the distance between a father and his daughter. The moment the hammer finally fell, the room erupted, flashbulbs bursting like fireworks, shutters clicking in rapid succession as reporters flooded the space with questions. The watch had sold for over $3 million, but its true value was written not in ink or currency, but in the awed faces around me. Strangers I had never met shook my hand, eyes bright with gratitude, thanking me for preserving a piece of history that somehow belonged to all of them. Their words washed over me in waves. Thank you for sharing this story. We needed to remember what real sacrifice looks like. Your father and you are heroes. Sophie sat a few seats down, her posture rigid, her designer heels tucked inward as if trying to shrink herself out of the spotlight. She watched, wide-eyed and trembling, as the very people she once envied now honored the watch, and by extension honored me. I caught her gaze for only a second, and in that instant I saw the flicker of something I hadn't seen in a long time: remorse, shame, a dawning realization that what she had dismissed was priceless, and that her laughter had echoed in a hall of solemn respect. Reporters jostled for quotes, scribbling furiously on notepads. One young journalist leaned toward me and asked, "Sir, what will you do with the proceeds?" I looked to Sophie, who sat rigid and silent, and then back at the sea of faces. "The watch belongs in a museum," I said, voice steady. "Its story belongs to everyone." The crowd nodded, cameras trained not on me but on the empty velvet cushion where the watch had rested. Sophie's shoulders slumped as she rose to leave, inconspicuous now in her tailored suit. People stepped aside, offering polite smiles and murmured nods. On her way out, an elderly collector paused, placed a gentle hand on her arm, and said, "You did your father proud." Sophie simply nodded, eyes downcast, realizing in that moment that respect and legacy cannot be bought. They must be earned and cherished. And as the doors closed behind her, I understood that the greatest auction of all had just concluded, the bidding for human dignity and memory, won not by wealth but by truth. Sophie met me in the empty gallery beyond the auction room, her high heels echoing on the polished marble as she approached. The chatter of the crowd had faded behind us, leaving only the distant hum of conversations and the soft click of her shaky breath. She tried to force a smile, one of those brittle, practiced grins that barely touched her eyes, and laughed, a sound that cracked even as she let it go. I had no idea it was that valuable," she said, voice light as a feather caught in a storm. Her words tumbled out in a rush, excuses carefully chosen to shield her pride. The fast pace of her life, the endless swirl of her ambitions, the notion that a father's keepsake could never be more than sentiment wrapped in metal. But even as she spoke, her shoulders trembled with the weight of something far heavier than embarrassment. She was grasping for absolution she didn't deserve. I stood still, watching her unravel. My eyes were calm, no anger, no triumph, just the steady gaze of a man who had seen too much to be swayed by noise or tears. I let her words settle in the space between us, allowed the echoes of her laughter to fade. Then, softly, I said, "You didn't want to know." Those 4 words landed with the force of a stone dropped into glass. She blinked, her breath catching, as shame flooded her face in slow, hot waves. There was no anger in my voice, only truth, stripped bare, an accusation without hostility, a mirror held up to the emptiness she'd left in our relationship. In that moment, her walls collapsed. She looked down, folding her arms around herself, as if to hold together the pieces of her pride. The sparkle of her suit seemed absurd beneath the gallery lights. Gone was the polished veneer of confidence. She stood small, vulnerable, confronted by the legacy she had scorned. And in her silence, I felt both the ache of loss and the fragile stirrings of something new, an understanding that no apology could erase but perhaps could be the first step toward redemption. He found me standing just outside the auction hall, the velvet cushion now empty in my hand, when the elderly historian approached, his shoulders bent by age but his eyes sharp with devotion. He wore a simple tweed jacket and a silver chain hung from his vest pocket, perhaps another reminder of time's passage. I could tell he carried a reverence for history deeper than any auctioneer's ledger. "Oh, Mr. Whitaker," he began, voice warm but insistent, "I'd like to purchase the watch, but more than that, I wish to ensure its story reaches as many hearts as possible." He paused, and I saw in his eyes the weight of every museum exhibit he'd ever curated, the silent hopes of forgotten artifacts waiting to be remembered. "I intend to donate it to the National War Museum," he said softly, "so that future generations can stand before it and understand what sacrifice really means." I felt a swell of gratitude, and something more, a flicker of pride I hadn't felt in years. He offered me his hand, not just in transaction, but in partnership. "I have one request," he continued, pulling a small card and a pen from his pocket. "Your name must be etched beside the watch, as its custodian, because without you, this legacy would have died in obscurity." His words settled on me like a benediction. In that moment, I saw my father's kindness reflected back through the decades, the selfless courage that had saved a young lieutenant, the quiet gratitude in his gift. Now, standing before this man who understood that a name could carry meaning, I realized that passing on this watch to strangers was not abandonment. It was the truest form of respect. I took the pen, my hand steady, and wrote my name on the card. My heart throbbed with a mixture of relief and wonder. "Thank you," I whispered, but it felt too small for what had just happened. Later, in the quiet halls of the museum, they installed the watch behind glass, its brass case gleaming under soft lights. On the plaque below, in elegant lettering, it reads, "Pocket watch of Lieutenant Charles Whitmore, presented to the National War Museum by the Whittaker family. Custodian, Edward Whittaker." Sophie stood beside me, her hand slipping into mine. We gazed up at the inscription together, and in that shared silence, I felt her finally understand. The watch was no longer hidden. Its truth was laid bare, etched in metal and memory, and our family's legacy, once fractured by misunderstanding, had found its place in history's steady march. Sophie stepped into her apartment as the elevator doors slid shut behind her, the hush of the hallway swallowed by the thick carpet beneath her feet. The grand foyer, usually immaculate and gleaming, suddenly felt cavernous, its high ceilings and open floor plan echoing back at her in a hollow whisper. She set down her designer tote on the marble console and paused, the leather heel of her stiletto catching on the plush rug. She moved through the rooms in slow motion, as though each step might shatter the illusion she had built with every purchase, every curated detail. The living room's floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city skyline, but tonight the lights looked distant, sterile, no longer a panorama of possibility, but a reminder of how far removed she'd become from anything real. In the bedroom, she crossed to the full-length mirror and stopped. The reflection that stared back at her was unfamiliar. Crisp suit jacket, expensive jewelry gleaming, hair perfectly styled. But beneath the surface, hollow eyes told a different story. She reached out, one gloved hand trembling as though she could touch the woman she'd been before ambition consumed her, before she laughed at her father's treasure. She remembered the hush of the auction house, the reverent hush that replaced her laughter. She remembered her father's calm words, "You didn't want to know." She remembered the historian's gentle insistence that this watch deserved a place in history, not a bargain bin. And now, alone in this cavernous luxury, Sophie realized for the first time that money had built her walls, and in doing so, had shut out everything she truly needed: connection, history, meaning. She wandered into the sitting area where a chaise lounge sat under an abstract painting, an artwork she could not recall choosing. She perched on its edge, fingertips brushing the velvet as if seeking warmth. The silence pressed in on her, oppressive and intimate all at once. No chimes of messages, no buzzing of notifications, just the steady hum of the air conditioning and her own rapid heartbeat. Her gaze drifted to a shelf lined with trophies, awards for sales targets met, plaques celebrating achievements she had once dreamed of. Each one felt now like a hollow echo of accomplishment, proof of success that had cost her everything she couldn't buy back. A quiet tear traced a line down her cheek. The watch's story had shown her what real value meant: the beating of borrowed time, the sacrifice of another man's life, the weight of a father's love woven into metal. Here, in all her opulence, she had forfeited the right to that story. She had traded legacy for a ledger, history for headlines, and now she sat amidst all the grandeur and felt the chill of emptiness. Sophie curled into herself on the chaise, clutching the memory of that watch's ticking echo in her mind. For the first time she felt the gravity of loss, not the loss of material things, but the loss of a bond that no amount of wealth could reconstruct. And in the stillness of her apartment, she understood that the richest among us are those who carry their past forward, who honor the stories that make us who we are, and that she had almost let hers slip away forever. Weeks passed like unspoken prayers before Sophie found the courage to return. It was a gray afternoon when she stood at my door, hesitant as a child before confession, clutching a worn photograph, the edges soft with age and handling. In the picture, My father and I sat on the porch of our old country house, his broad grin catching the sunlight, my small frame curled against his side, both of us oblivious to time's march. She stepped inside as though crossing a threshold into another world, one where the past still lived and breathed. I watched her hands tremble as she unfolded the photograph, her eyes tracing the lines of our younger faces. There were no apologies in her expression, only a quiet resolve, a plea to understand rather than to absolve. "Dad," she began, voice low and steady, "I don't want to pretend I know what that watch meant. I only want to learn." She placed the photograph on the table between us, sliding it until it lay flat, a silent bridge across the distance we'd let grow. "Tell me about this day, about him, about why that watch was everything to you." I felt the weight of her request settle in my chest, equal parts relief and sorrow. No longer was she demanding explanations or excuses. She was seeking truth. I took the photo in my hands and held it up to my eyes. I saw my father's laugh lines, the worn collar of his uniform, the sparkle in his eyes when he looked at me. "I remember that morning," I said softly, voice trembling as much as hers. "He woke me before dawn, said there would be work to do on the farm, and that a real man gets up with the sun." I smiled at the memory, his boots creaking on the porch, the aroma of fresh coffee, the invitation to share in something simple and sacred. After breakfast, he gave me the watch. He told me it belonged to a man he'd saved during the war, and that from that moment on, it carried more than time. It carried responsibility. Sophie leaned forward, eyes bright with tears she fought to hold back. She placed her hand over mine, warm and unsteady. "I want to know that responsibility," she whispered. "Not just the history, but the promise. How do I carry it forward?" I looked at her, the woman who had once laughed at my treasure, and saw something new. Humility tempered by curiosity, ambition reshaped by reverence. I nodded once, deliberately, the single motion carrying the weight of a lifetime. "We begin with listening," I said, "and with remembering. We honor what came before by living with purpose, by recognizing that every moment is borrowed, and every legacy is a gift meant to be shared." In that quiet room, with the photograph between us, and the memory of the watch echoing in our hearts, Sophie didn't kneel or beg forgiveness. She sat upright, hungry for wisdom, ready to rebuild the bond she had almost lost. And as I leaned across the table to guide her through stories of sacrifice, of love, of time, measured not in wealth but in moments, I realized we were both learning to become custodians, not of an object, but of a truth far greater than ourselves. Time felt different in that hushed gallery, slower, deeper, as though each tick of the watch echoed beyond its tiny chamber and settled in our bones. Sophie and I stood side by side in front of the glass case, our fingers intertwined so lightly it was as if we were both afraid to break the spell. I was slender now, my shoulders curved by years, my hair silver at the temples. Sophie was beautiful still, but her beauty had softened into something kinder, her eyes warm with reverence rather than ambition. The watch lay on a cushion of deep blue velvet, its brass case shining under gentle spotlights. The plaque beneath it read in elegant script, "A legacy of sacrifice misunderstood by blood but honored by truth." Visitors drifted through the room, their faces lit by curiosity and respect. They paused to read the inscription, then pressed their hands against their hearts, as though pledging silent gratitude to an invisible history. I watched their reflections in the glass, felt their awe ripple toward us like waves. Sophie leaned closer and whispered, "Dad, look at them." Her voice trembled, not with sorrow, but with a quiet joy that made my chest ache. Together we looked upon those strangers who now knew our story, who honored the promise born of war and love, of a father's undying courage. I squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of life between us. "We did it," I said softly, tears pricking my eyes. "We kept it alive." Her head rested against my shoulder, and for a moment it was as if the decades fell away. I was that boy on the old porch, clutching my father's hand, hearing the dawn birds call. She was the little girl at my knee, wide-eyed, begging for another story. Only now we stood here together, The final chapter written not in cold ink, but in every heartbeat filling this room. A curator approached with a gentle smile and offered us seats nearby, inviting us to share a few words. But all I needed was this: my daughter beside me, her gaze steady on the watch that had once been just a trinket in her eyes, now the heart of our family's truth. As the crowd hushed and cameras dimmed, Sophie raised her head. Her lips parted, but no words came, only tears gliding silently down her cheeks, the kind that speak of understanding far deeper than any apology. And in her eyes, I saw the unspoken promise of legacy carried forward, of stories passed from one generation to the next, time restored. And at that moment, I knew our story would never be forgotten, not while this watch ticked on, reminding the world that some legacies live far longer than a single lifetime.